Welcome to Sassy, Soulful, and Sensitive, the podcast for introverts, empaths, and highly sensitive people. I'm your host, Cam Nichols, and I'm here to guide and explore with you how to tune into your intuition, step into your radical self, and find your voice. If you want to ditch the feeling of being a tortured, out-of-place soul in this great big world, and learn how to speak up for all of your wants and needs and create a more peaceful, content, and empowered life, all while having more fun, keep listening. Hello, you beautiful, sexy, magical being. You are gorgeous. All right, so let's dive in. Today, I wanted to talk about vulnerability, intimacy, and feeling safe, right? So the last few episodes, we've talked about the intro to meaningful relationships and lovability, unconditional versus conditional love. And so the next step that's really important as far as relationships is vulnerability and creating that intimacy with another person. In order to do that, you need to feel safe. So first, let's talk about what it means to be vulnerable. Like, think about that question. Like, what is that definition for you? How would you define it? So for the sake of today, it's like, what does it mean to be vulnerable? It means to basically share your inner monologue. That's really kind of what it comes down to in like the simplest terms, right? So the thoughts and feelings and opinions and that we have just in ourselves, about the world, about other people, whoever, that inside voice, that inner monologue, sharing that is vulnerable, right? So that's kind of like how I want to think about it. And there's a reason why it can be like vulnerability is such a struggle for introverts, empaths, and highly sensitive people. And I see this in all of my clients. And this is something that we really delve deeper into. And this is also something like I've noticed in myself, like even as recent as like last week, like it's really, it's tough to be vulnerable and just kind of like put yourself out there. And if I'm being completely honest, I have put off recording this episode because of it. I needed to work through some stuff in order to be vulnerable with you, because that's the kind of community that I want to be a part of and I want to create for all of us as sensitive people. So let's talk about why we struggle with vulnerability. Like, even in our closest and most intimate relationships, we still struggle with being vulnerable, especially because we're sensitive to other people's energy, right? The slightest energy shift, which even intellectually, if we know that it's about the other person and what they're thinking, doing, feeling, all of that, like, because we can feel it, there is this sense that we're kind of responsible. And even if we know that is not true, like, feeling that slightest shift can completely throw us off. And it can create this feeling of unsafety. Is that a word? Unsafety? Not safe, right? So like our brains are naturally wired to look for anything that could be dangerous. So back when in the caveman days, right, when we were like fighting off predators and like for daily life, we could be eaten alive, or we could eat poisonous berries, or I don't know, any other thing that like threatens our physical survival. Like, we needed our brain to be on alert for danger. But now, in modern day society, like, this is not the same as it was back then. Like, most of the world does not have to worry about being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. They have to worry about what their boss is going to say about their work, what their spouse is going to think about their opinion, right? So the primitive brain, like we as society and as humans have developed, but there's still that primitive brain inside that hasn't caught up with the rest of us. And that's part of why it is so scary to be vulnerable, because that part of the brain cannot tell the difference between physical danger and emotional danger. And emotional danger, like I'm saying in quotes, you can't see it, but because like there's nothing, emotions aren't dangerous. They're just vibrations in the body, and they're just messengers. They're just information, right? But our primitive brain cannot tell the difference. It just considers it all danger, which means it's all death. It's all going to die. It's all going to kill us. Avoid at all costs. So when we open ourselves up to be vulnerable, we're kind of telling that piece of our brain to like calm its shit. Like we're letting our guard down. And so it's so natural to struggle with speaking up and being vulnerable. And like I help people with finding their voice, right? And as I continue to refine and find new levels of my own voice, but this is what stops us, is this primitive brain, this fear of danger, this fear of being vulnerable. This is what stops us from voicing our needs and our wants and our concerns and our opinions. And so it is so important to understand like the natural human brain and why it struggles with vulnerability. Like we don't need to go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn for survival, right? Even though sometimes, especially with intense emotion, it totally triggers that response. And as you can imagine, and probably experienced yourself, it's difficult to build like a meaningful relationship when you can't be vulnerable, when you have a hard time sharing your inner monologue with someone else. So, as it comes to relationships, I want to offer to you that shared vulnerability creates intimacy. So, vulnerability is more about ourselves, right? Intimacy is more about that relational connection. And again, when we're talking about relationships, we're not just talking about romantic relationships. We're also talking about familial, colleague, friends, all of the above, right? But relationships are based on intimacy. And how do you create intimacy? Through shared vulnerability. And kind of what that comes to is like all of this just really comes down to learning how to feel safe, like safe with yourself so that you can be open and honest with how you're feeling. Be honest that you do have fear in sharing an opinion or a thought. Like there's trust and honesty you need to have with yourself in order to be vulnerable and create that intimacy. And it's not just about trust and honesty and safety with the other person, right? Like that's important too. But again, imagine your closest relationships. And then also imagine where you struggle to be vulnerable in those relationships. It's like, okay, if this is the person I am most willing to be vulnerable with, and I still struggle with being vulnerable, that just means we're kind of listening to our inner brain. We don't have that deep self-trust within ourselves to believe that we make our own safety, right? It goes back to, quote, emotional danger. It's not the same as physical danger, folks, but the brain can't tell the difference. So really think about what it's like to feel safe. And if you are in a safe place to do so, you're not driving or anything like that. Like if you're in a safe space, I want you to just close your eyes and I want you to imagine what it would be like if you didn't have to filter yourself at all. You didn't have to filter your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, your reactions, your behaviors, your judgments, none of it. And I just want you to imagine creating and feeling this feeling of safe and secure and really just roll around in it, right? Just kind of bring it around you like the warm, cozy blanket on a cold winter's day. Feel that safety, feel that security. But I want you to take that blanket of safety and feel it, right? And I want you to notice the physical sensations that you have. Like, what does that safety and security feel like in your body? Like, do you feel a expansiveness in your stomach or your heart? Do you feel a tingling in your shoulders? Right? Just notice what that safety and security feels like. and I really want you to take the time and really feel what it's like to feel safe and secure. Because the more that you do that and the time you spend accessing it, the easier access you're going to have to it later when you need it. Because this feeling of safety and security is something that you can call upon and you can create. Right? And if you're feeling it, just notice how you just kind of created this feeling out of thin air. Right? That's the power of practicing feeling emotion. Right? But especially with feeling safety and security. Because this, again, comes down to the trust we have in ourselves that no matter what happens, if we open up and be vulnerable, that we will be okay. That we can feel the doubt, terror, fear, confusion, whatever it may be, and that it's temporary. And that we will be okay, even if we go through an unpleasant feeling. I want to kind of leave you just with this feeling of safety and security, and just really notice, like, as you were imagining this, you probably just imagined yourself completely alone. Notice what happens when you imagine someone else entering your space. We are opening ourselves up when we're vulnerable. We are allowing someone else into our space, and we are entering someone else's energy, right? And we're allowing them access to our energy. Like, that alone is vulnerability, right? It takes a level of vulnerability to be in someone else's presence and have them be in yours. This is partly why we love being alone, right? It's safer to be alone in our own energy. And for a lot of the time, like, of your life, like, that's totally fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like, oh my gosh, love your alone time, relish in it, take as much as you need. But just notice, if you are longing for more meaningful relationships, are you using this safety of alone time to hold yourself back just because it's scary to be vulnerable, right? And if that's the case, like, go back and listen to the little imagination portion from a couple minutes ago and really practice feeling that safety and security. Practice feeling it alone. And then when you are out with friends or with family or whatever, practice it again. It could be more difficult to create it, but just like with everything, with more practice, more mastery. So that is what I want to leave you with today. I want you to understand that shared vulnerability is what creates intimacy. And in order to be vulnerable, in order to create intimacy with others, it really comes down to learning how to feel safe. Learning that deep trust that you're just a fucking badass. Even when you don't feel it, like, you are a badass, and there's nothing wrong with being who you are, needing alone time, being an overthinker. Like, I've done episodes in this already, right? But just the deep trust in who you are. Love yourself. When you love yourself, you're then open to loving others. All right, my friends, as always, remember that shining bright gives permission to others to shine as well. Take care. Hey, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. Be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcast, especially if you really liked it. If you didn't like it though, like, don't even worry about it. Also, head on over to coachwithcam.com, where I have a guided meditation I'd love to gift you, along with 3 of my favorite mini trainings. You'll also be able to see what webinars or programs or other offerings I have coming up. Change how you show up for yourself in this world? Then go out and change the world.